My wicked mother-in-law spent 6 months planning my murder, but I ruined everything in 6 seconds with one glass switch. Welcome to Revenge Galore. If you crave gripping stories, where justice hits hard and betrayal never goes unpunished, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and join us for your daily dose of raw, emotional, and unforgettable justice. My name is Derek Ashfield and I'm 32 years old. I've been married to my wife Cassandra for 3 years, and in that time I've learned that her mother, Vivian Harrington, would rather see me disappear than remain part of their family. What I discovered at last month's anniversary dinner nearly made that wish come true, just not in the way she intended. I should have seen it coming. The signs were all there, subtle but persistent, like poison slowly seeping into every family gathering. Vivian never missed an opportunity to remind everyone that I was beneath their social station, that Cassandra could have done so much better than a small-town mechanic, like me. The Harrington family had money, old money from Cassandra's grandfather's textile business, and they never let me forget it. I owned a custom motorcycle shop in downtown Portland, building bikes for clients who appreciated craftsmanship over corporate branding. It was honest work that I loved, but to Vivian I might as well have been collecting garbage. "Cassandra, darling," she'd say during family dinners, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "remember when you dated that lovely investment banker? What was his name? Timothy Blackstone? Such a distinguished young man from the Greenwich Blackstones." Cassandra would squeeze my hand under the table, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She loved her family despite their flaws, and being caught between us was tearing her apart. Reginald Harrington, Cassandra's father, wasn't much better. A retired insurance executive who spent his days playing golf and criticizing everyone else's career choices, he'd cornered me at every family gathering to explain why my business was unsustainable in the modern economy. "Motorcycles are a dying industry, Derek," he'd pronounce with the authority of someone who'd never actually worked on anything with his hands. "You should consider something more stable. Perhaps insurance sales. I could make some calls." The evening of September 15th started like every other Harrington family dinner, with uncomfortable pleasantries and thinly veiled criticisms. We were celebrating Reginald and Vivian's 35th wedding anniversary at their sprawling colonial house in Lake Oswego, and the guest list included Cassandra's brother Nathan with his wife Priscilla, her aunt Cordelia, and her cousin Bartholomew with his latest girlfriend. I'd arrived early to help set up, hoping to smooth things over after our last encounter, when Vivian had accidentally spilled red wine on the white button-down shirt I'd worn to their country club dinner. Cassandra had insisted it was an accident, but I'd seen the calculation in her mother's eyes. "Derek, how thoughtful of you to come early," Vivian said as I entered through the kitchen door. She was wearing an elegant navy dress and her signature pearl necklace, looking every inch the society matron she prided herself on being. "Perhaps you could move some chairs from the garage? I'm sure you're more suited to manual labor than the other guests." I bit back my response and focused on helping. The dining room was set with their finest china, spode blue Italian pattern that Vivian never failed to mention was irreplaceable family heirloom. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier, and silver serving pieces gleamed on the mahogany sideboard. As the other guests arrived, I found myself studying the family dynamics with the same attention to detail I brought to motorcycle engines. There were patterns here, subtle mechanisms of control and manipulation that kept everyone in their assigned roles. Vivian orchestrated conversations like a conductor, steering topics away from my work and toward subjects that highlighted my outsider status. When Nathan mentioned his recent promotion at the law firm, she beamed with pride. When Bartholomew discussed his art gallery opening, she gushed about his refined sensibilities. When I tried to contribute to a discussion about craftsmanship, she changed the subject. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, with Vivian presiding from one end of the long table and Reginald from the other. I was seated between Aunt Cordelia, who smelled like lavender and disapproval, and Bartholomew's girlfriend, a nervous young woman who kept apologizing for everything. The conversation flowed around topics I wasn't expected to understand: charity galas, investment portfolios, country club politics. I ate quietly, responding when spoken to directly but otherwise observing the intricate social choreography that kept the Harrington family functioning. After dinner, we moved to the living room for drinks and anniversary toasts. The room was decorated in traditional style, heavy furniture, oil paintings of disapproving ancestors, and enough antiques to stock a museum. Vivian played hostess, moving gracefully between guests with a silver tray of cocktails. "I've prepared something special for everyone," she announced, her voice carrying that particular tone of satisfaction she got when orchestrating social events. Anniversary cocktails made with champagne and a touch of elderflower liqueur. It's a recipe I learned in France. She handed out crystal glasses filled with pale, fizzing liquid. Each guest received their drink with appropriate ceremony, Nathan first as the eldest son, then Priscilla, followed by the other family members in order of social precedence. I watched this ritual with growing unease. There was something too deliberate about Vivian's movements, too much attention paid to ensuring each person received a specific glass. When she finally approached me, her smile was particularly bright. "And Derek, I've made yours extra special," she said, pressing a glass into my hands. "I know you're not used to sophisticated cocktails, so I added a little something to make it more palatable." The glass was identical to the others, but something in her tone set off every alarm in my head. I'd learned to trust my instincts working with machinery. When something felt wrong, it usually was wrong. And everything about this moment felt wrong. I thanked her politely and raised the glass as Reginald began his anniversary toast. "To 35 years of marriage," he declared, "and to family traditions that endure through changing times." Everyone raised their glasses, but I found myself studying Vivian's face instead of drinking. There was an intensity in her expression, a focus that reminded me of a cat watching a mouse. She was waiting for something. That's when I noticed that she wasn't drinking from her own glass. Her lips touched the rim, but no liquid passed her lips. It was a subtle deception, but my years of troubleshooting complex problems had taught me to notice small discrepancies. The room erupted in conversation after the toast, and I used the distraction to move closer to Reginald, who was holding court near the fireplace, complaining about the city's latest tax assessments. "Property values don't justify these increases," he was saying to Nathan. "When I was in insurance, we understood the relationship between risk and reward. Today's politicians wouldn't recognize sound fiscal policy if it bit them on the—" He paused to take a sip of his cocktail, and I saw my opportunity. In one smooth motion, honed by years of quick reflexes working around dangerous machinery, I reached across and switched our glasses. The exchange took less than 2 seconds, hidden by my body as I stepped closer to join the conversation. "Interesting point about tax policy, Mr. Harrington," I said, now holding his glass while he held mine. "Do you think the assessment methodology needs reform?" It was a question designed to trigger one of his lengthy explanations, giving him reason to gesture emphatically with the glass I'd handed him. He launched into a detailed critique of municipal finance, pausing periodically to sip from what he thought was his own cocktail. I pretended to listen while keeping one eye on Vivian. She was positioned where she could see both Reginald and me, and I noticed her checking her watch. Whatever she was expecting, it was supposed to happen on a schedule. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. Reginald was still talking, his voice growing slightly louder and more animated than usual. I attributed it to his favorite subject and the alcohol, but then I noticed something else. His pupils were dilated, and his gestures were becoming more exaggerated. "The problem with these bureaucrats," he was saying, his words beginning to slur slightly, "is they don't understand basic economics. When I was running the Portland office, we knew how to manage risk." He swayed slightly and reached out to steady himself against the mantelpiece. Nathan noticed and moved closer. "Dad, are you feeling all right?" Reginald blinked several times as if trying to focus. "Just a little warm in here. Must be the excitement of the anniversary." But I could see it wasn't excitement. His coordination was deteriorating rapidly, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor. Whatever had been in that drink was working its way through his system. Vivian appeared at my elbow, her face a mask of concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Derek, you look pale. Are you feeling well?" I met her gaze steadily. "I feel fine, Mrs. Harrington. Perfect, actually." Something flickered across her face, confusion, then a growing alarm as she looked from me to her husband, who was now leaning heavily against the fireplace. "Reginald?" she called out, her voice tight with what might have been genuine panic. "Darling, what's wrong?" He tried to respond, but the words came out garbled. His knees buckled, and Nathan caught him before he could fall. "Call 911. Nathan shouted, and the room erupted into chaos. I pulled out my phone and dialed emergency services while Cassandra rushed to her father's side. Vivian stood frozen, staring at her husband with an expression I couldn't quite read, shock, fear, and something that looked almost like calculation. 911, what's your emergency? We need an ambulance at 2847 Lakeshore Drive in Lake Oswego. A 68-year-old man appears to be having some kind of medical emergency. He's conscious but disoriented, with dilated pupils and loss of coordination. I provided additional details while watching Vivian's reaction. She was pale and trembling, but her eyes kept darting between her husband and me, as if trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, professional and efficient as they assessed Reginald's condition. He was conscious but confused, unable to answer basic questions about the date or his location. "What has he consumed this evening?" the lead paramedic asked. "Just dinner and a cocktail," Vivian answered quickly. "Nothing unusual." This came on suddenly. I spoke up. "He was drinking champagne with elderflower liqueur. Mrs. Harrington made special anniversary cocktails for everyone." The paramedic nodded and continued his assessment. Reginald's vital signs were stable, but his neurological symptoms were concerning enough to warrant immediate transport to the hospital. As they loaded him into the ambulance, Vivian climbed in beside him, still clutching her untouched cocktail glass. The rest of us followed in cars, the anniversary celebration forgotten in the rush to Providence Portland Medical Center. In the hospital waiting room, I found myself studying the family dynamics once again. Nathan was on the phone with his father's doctor, Cassandra was comforting her Aunt Cordelia, and Bartholomew was awkwardly trying to console his girlfriend, who seemed traumatized by the entire experience. I noticed that Vivian had brought her cocktail glass with her to the hospital, holding it carefully as if it were precious. When a nurse offered to dispose of it, she clutched it closer. "No, thank you. It's fine." But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this situation was fine. Dr. Patricia Fleming, the emergency room physician, emerged after 2 hours with preliminary results. "Mr. Harrington is stable, but we're still determining the cause of his symptoms. His blood work shows elevated levels of a prescription medication that's not on his current medication list." "What kind of medication?" Nathan asked. "Zolpidem, it's a sleep aid commonly known by the brand name Ambien. He has approximately 10 times the normal therapeutic dose in his system." The room fell silent. Vivian's face went completely white. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Reginald doesn't take sleeping pills. He's never had trouble sleeping." Dr. Fleming consulted her chart. "The levels are consistent with someone crushing multiple tablets and dissolving them in liquid. This wasn't an accidental overdose. Someone deliberately administered this medication." The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Someone had tried to drug Reginald, but based on Vivian's earlier attention to my specific glass, I was supposed to be the one unconscious in that hospital bed. Detective Sarah Kowalski arrived an hour later, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who introduced herself as a specialist in cases involving suspected poisoning or drugging. She interviewed each family member separately, starting with Nathan and working her way through the group. When my turn came, I told her exactly what I'd observed. Vivian's careful attention to distributing specific glasses, her comment about making my drink extra special, and my decision to switch glasses with Reginald. "You switched glasses deliberately?" Detective Kowalski asked, making notes. "Yes." Something felt wrong about the whole situation. Mrs. Harrington's behavior was too focused, too deliberate. And she wasn't actually drinking from her own glass during the toast. "Did you tell anyone about switching the glasses?" "Not until now. I wanted to see what happened first." The detective studied me carefully. "Mr. Ashfield, are you aware that if your suspicions are correct, you may have saved your own life while inadvertently poisoning your father-in-law?" "I'm aware of that possibility. But I also know that if I hadn't switched the glasses, Mr. Harrington might never have known what his wife was capable of." Detective Kowalski interviewed Vivian last, and I could hear raised voices through the closed conference room door. When they emerged 30 minutes later, Vivian's composure had cracked completely. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, and her hands were shaking. "Mrs. Harrington has agreed to surrender the cocktail glass for testing," the detective announced. "We'll also need samples of any remaining ingredients used to make the drinks." Vivian said nothing, but her silence was more telling than any protest would have been. The toxicology report on the cocktail glass confirmed what we already suspected. The liquid contained enough dissolved zolpidem to render an adult unconscious for 8 to 12 hours, with potential for respiratory depression and other life-threatening complications. Detective Kowalski called me the next afternoon with additional findings. "We found the source of the medication, Mr. Ashfield. Mrs. Harrington had a prescription for Ambien that she filled 2 weeks ago. The pharmacy records show she purchased 30 tablets, but we only found 22 remaining in the bottle. So she used 8 tablets to make the drink? That's consistent with the concentration we found. She crushed them and dissolved them in the elderflower liqueur before adding the champagne. It would have masked the bitter taste of the medication." I felt a chill run down my spine. Detective, what would that amount of zolpidem have done to someone my size? Probably rendered you unconscious within 20 to 30 minutes. At that concentration, there was also risk of respiratory depression, especially if combined with alcohol. If no one had realized you were in medical distress. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Vivian hadn't just been trying to drug me, she created a dose that could have killed me. The formal charges were filed 3 days later: attempted murder in the first degree, assault in the first degree, and reckless endangerment. The district attorney's office treated it as a domestic violence case involving attempted spousal murder, even though I wasn't technically Vivian's spouse. The news spread through Lake Oswego's social circles like wildfire. The Harrington family, pillars of the community for 3 generations, were suddenly the subject of whispered conversations at the country club and horrified gossip among the charity circuit elite. Cassandra was devastated. She'd spent her entire life believing in her mother's inherent goodness, despite the manipulation and control. Learning that Vivian had tried to kill her husband shattered something fundamental in her worldview. "I keep thinking about all the times she criticized you," Cassandra said as we sat in our living room, still processing the magnitude of what had happened. All the little comments, the deliberate slights. I thought she'd come around eventually. I held her hand while she cried. "Your mother has problems that go way beyond disapproving of your choice in husbands. This level of planning, the calculated risk-taking, this isn't normal family dysfunction." Reginald's recovery was slow but complete. The overdose had affected his short-term memory and coordination for several weeks, requiring physical therapy and cognitive rehabilitation. But perhaps more significantly, it had opened his eyes to his wife's true nature. He visited our house 2 weeks after the arrest, looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen him. "Derek, I owe you an apology," he said, settling carefully into our living room chair. "And probably my life." "Mr. Harrington, you don't need to." "Yes, I do." His voice was firm despite his physical frailty. "I've spent 3 years criticizing you, questioning your worthiness to be part of our family. Meanwhile, the person I should have been questioning was sleeping next to me every night." He paused, staring out our window at the small garden Cassandra had planted. "The police found her journal, Derek. She'd been planning this for months. She researched the medication, calculated dosages, even planned what she'd tell the paramedics when you collapsed." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. This hadn't been a moment of impulse or desperation. It had been a methodical, calculated attempt at murder. "The worst part," Reginald continued, "is that she was prepared to let me be blamed if something went wrong. She'd positioned herself as the grieving hostess who'd done everything possible to help. If you'd died, I would have been the one who handed you the poison drink." I hadn't considered that angle, but it made perfect sense. Vivian had orchestrated the evening so that any investigation would focus on the drink I'd supposedly received from Reginald, not the one she'd carefully prepared for me. "She's a sociopath," I said quietly. "This level of manipulation and planning isn't something a normal person is capable of." Reginald nodded slowly. 35 years of marriage and I never saw it. Or maybe I did see it but chose to ignore it because acknowledging it would have meant admitting I'd wasted my entire adult life. The trial began 4 months later, and it was a media sensation. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman so consumed by class prejudice and control that she tried to murder her son-in-law rather than accept him as part of the family. Vivian's defense attorney tried to argue that the poisoning was intended to cause temporary incapacitation, not death, but the toxicology evidence contradicted that claim. The concentration of medication was consistent with intent to cause severe harm or death. I testified about the evening's events, describing Vivian's behavior and my decision to switch glasses. The prosecutor walked me through each detail, establishing the premeditation and malicious intent required for attempted murder charges. "Mr. Ashfield, when you decided to switch glasses with your father-in-law, did you know that Mrs. Harrington had drugged your drink?" "I suspected something was wrong, but I didn't know specifically what. Her behavior was too calculated, too focused on ensuring I received a particular glass. It felt like a setup." "What made you suspicious of her motives?" 3 years of being treated like an unwelcome intruder in the family, combined with her unusual attention to drink distribution that evening. Mrs. Harrington had made it clear she wanted me out of her daughter's life. I just didn't realize how far she was willing to go. Vivian's attorney cross-examined me aggressively, trying to suggest that I'd switched glasses maliciously, knowing they were drugged and intending to harm Reginald. But the timeline didn't support that theory. I'd made the switch before anyone showed symptoms, based purely on suspicious behavior. The most damning evidence came from Vivian's own planning materials. Police had found detailed notes about zolpidem dosages, researched methods for disguising the taste, and even contingency plans for different scenarios. She'd thought through every aspect except the possibility that I might be observant enough to notice her behavior and take protective action. Dr. Emily Rothstein, a forensic psychiatrist, testified about Vivian's psychological profile. Mrs. Harrington exhibits classic narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial features. She views other people as obstacles to be managed or eliminated, rather than as individuals with inherent worth. The level of planning involved in this case suggests someone who feels entitled to control others' lives, even to the point of ending them. Reginald's testimony was particularly devastating. He described 35 years of subtle manipulation, social control, and emotional abuse that he'd normalized as strong personality traits. In retrospect, he could see patterns of behavior that suggested Vivian had always been capable of extreme actions when her control was threatened. She once told me that people who couldn't adapt to their proper social station should be removed from society, he testified. I thought she was being dramatic. Now I realize she was being literal. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Vivian showed no emotion as the verdict was read, maintaining the same composed facade she'd worn throughout the trial. At sentencing, Judge Margaret Thorne addressed Vivian directly. Mrs. Harrington, you've shown no remorse for your actions and no recognition of the severity of what you attempted. You tried to murder a family member because you disapproved of your daughter's choice in spouse. The premeditation and callousness involved in this crime warrant the maximum sentence allowed by law. Vivian received 25 years in prison for attempted murder, with additional concurrent sentences for the assault and endangerment charges. At 64 years old, she would likely spend the rest of her life behind bars. As we left the courthouse, Cassandra leaned against me, emotionally drained but relieved that the legal proceedings were finally over. I keep thinking about all the family dinners, all the time she seemed caring and protective. How much of that was real? Probably none of it, I said gently. People like your mother don't experience genuine care or affection. They mimic it when it serves their purposes. Reginald had undergone a complete transformation during the months since the poisoning. The man who'd spent 3 years criticizing my career choices had become one of my strongest supporters, even investing in my motorcycle shop's expansion. I wasted too many years listening to someone who saw people as possessions to be controlled, he told me during one of our weekly dinners. I want to spend whatever time I have left appreciating the people who actually matter. The attempted murder had paradoxically brought the family closer together. Nathan and I developed a genuine friendship, bonding over our shared experience of dealing with Vivian's manipulation. Cassandra's relationship with her father deepened as they both processed the trauma of realizing they'd been living with a dangerous predator. The most unexpected consequence was the change in my own perspective. For 3 years, I'd internalized Vivian's criticisms, wondering if maybe I really wasn't good enough for Cassandra or worthy of being part of their family. The revelation that she tried to kill me put those doubts into context. Her disapproval hadn't been about my worthiness but about her need to control every aspect of her daughter's life. You saved all of us, Cassandra said one evening as we sat on our porch watching the sunset. If you hadn't switched those glasses, I might have lost both my husband and my father that night. I thought about that observation often in the months that followed. By trusting my instincts and taking protective action, I'd not only saved my own life but exposed a dangerous predator who'd been hiding in plain sight for decades. The quick thinking that came from years of troubleshooting mechanical problems had served me well in recognizing and responding to human malfunction. The motorcycle shop flourished with Reginald's investment and support. We expanded into custom fabrication and vintage restoration, attracting clients from across the Pacific Northwest. More importantly, I was building something lasting with people who valued craftsmanship and integrity over social status. Vivian's conviction made headlines in the local newspapers and trade publications, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of family toxicity and domestic violence. The case was used in law enforcement training programs as an example of how premeditated poisoning cases should be investigated and prosecuted. 2 years after the trial, I received a letter from Vivian in prison. It was a single page written in her careful handwriting. Derek, I want you to know that I don't regret my actions, only their failure. You never deserved to be part of our family, and your continued presence in Cassandra's life remains an insult to everything we've built over generations. The fact that you're alive while I'm in prison represents a fundamental injustice that I hope will someday be corrected. Vivian Harrington. I showed the letter to Detective Kowalski, who added it to Vivian's file as evidence of continued threat and lack of rehabilitation. It also confirmed what we'd all suspected: given the opportunity, she would try again. "Some people never change," the detective told me. "Your mother-in-law is exactly the same person who tried to kill you 2 years ago. She just has fewer opportunities to act on those impulses." I kept the letter as a reminder of why trusting my instincts had been so important that night. Vivian's hatred was pure and unwavering, untempered by reason or conscience. If I'd drunk from that glass, I wouldn't have survived to read her continued threats. The experience taught me valuable lessons about family dynamics, personal safety, and the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong. I'd spent 3 years trying to win acceptance from people who saw me as an obstacle rather than a person. Now I focused my energy on relationships built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Cassandra and I renewed our wedding vows on the 3rd anniversary of the poisoning attempt, surrounded by family members who chose to celebrate our marriage rather than sabotage it. Reginald walked Cassandra down the aisle, tears streaming down his face as he placed her hand in mine. "Take care of each other," he whispered to both of us. "Family is precious, but only when it's built on love instead of control." As I looked out at the gathering, Nathan and Priscilla with their new baby, Aunt Cordelia beaming with approval, Bartholomew and his girlfriend, now fiancée, holding hands in the front row, I realized that sometimes the most toxic family members' removal can heal relationships you didn't even know were damaged. The motorcycle shop continued to grow, and I started teaching welding and fabrication classes at the local community college, sharing skills with students who appreciated craftsmanship and attention to detail. Some of my former critics from the country club even became customers, drawn by the reputation for quality work that Vivian had tried so hard to dismiss. 3 years after the trial, Detective Kowalski called with an update. Vivian Harrington was involved in an incident at the prison last week. She attempted to poison another inmate with cleaning chemicals. I wasn't surprised. What happened? The other inmate survived, barely. Vivian's been moved to solitary confinement, and additional charges are being filed. She'll never see the outside of a prison again. The news brought closure to a chapter I'd thought was already finished. Vivian's continued attempts at poisoning confirmed that her actions toward me hadn't been an aberration or moment of desperation. They'd been expressions of her fundamental nature. Looking back on that September evening, I'm struck by how a moment of intuitive action changed everything. If I'd ignored my instincts and drunk from that glass, Vivian would have gotten away with murder. The family would have mourned my tragic accidental overdose, never knowing they'd been living with a killer. Instead, quick thinking and careful observation exposed the truth and saved multiple lives. The attempted murder that was supposed to destroy my marriage actually strengthened it, and the woman who tried to eliminate me from the family ended up eliminating herself. Sometimes justice comes through the legal system, sometimes through karma, and sometimes through the simple act of trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. In Vivian's case, it came through all three: her own scheme turned against her, delivered by the very person she tried to destroy. The best revenge, I learned, isn't plotting elaborate payback schemes. It's living well despite someone's attempts to destroy you, and watching as their own toxicity ultimately consumes them. Vivian spent years planning my downfall, but in the end, her hatred and arrogance became the instruments of her own destruction. And every time I raise a glass at family gatherings now, I'm reminded of how fortunate I am to be alive to celebrate with people who actually want me there. What would you have done if you noticed someone acting suspiciously around your drink? Have you ever had to deal with a toxic family member who crossed the line from manipulation to outright danger? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Revenge Galore for more stories where justice prevails and toxic behavior backfires spectacularly. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest tales of revenge and vindication.